It's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel on religious freedom as a liberal right. I imagine that our discussion will encompass issues that we cannot quite anticipate, but among them will surely be the separation of church and state and controversies about whether or not particular religions are inherently illiberal, or what should be done when religious rights conflict with other freedoms or values. Our speakers whose credentials appear in your program are Akeel Bilgrami, Daniel Steinmetz-Jenkins, and Winnifred Sullivan. Each of our speakers will hold forth for about 5 minutes, after which they will engage with one another and then respond to questions from the audience. We're going to go alphabetically, and Akeel Bilgrami will start us off. Akeel.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to explore seeming paradox or seeming and vexatious difficulty in our thinking in the last several decades, which is a product of the rise of multiculturalism, which is basically a phenomenon that emerged in Europe as a result of the migrations to fix a war-devastated economy in many European countries, and multiculturalism grew out of that minoritarian culture that emerged. And it came out of a great sympathy for the sufferings of minorities in European countries. And this is a phenomenon that since then has spread to different and distant parts of the world. Now, one of the paradox really is that sympathy for a minority sometimes extends to the point that one has to, as a result of that sympathy, overlook what seem to us as sympathizers to be invidious practices that owe a great deal to the religious grounds for those practices, having to do with gender mostly, but with attitudes towards other religions as well, infidels and so on. So that's the background. That's the sort of vexing paradox that we've been struggling with for the last many decades. Now, to speak initially to the Indian case, I think it's just a fact that, so let's take the gender issue, it's just a simple fact that Muslim women suffer at the hands of their men in India, but they suffer side by side with their men against Hindu majoritarianism. And so they are in a position of very often having to put aside their anger at the first frustration in order to focus on the second, because it is not chronic, it's emerged really viciously in the last 20 or 30 years. And so I like to call that basically the minoritarian mentality. That is, minorities are defined numerically, but what they give rise to is a mentality. And I think the idea of a minority is much more interesting when one thinks of it as a mentality rather than a statistical notion. And what I think is remarkable is that within, say, the Muslim community in India, Muslim peoples in India, most Muslims are not committed to any of the Sharia laws which are deeply committed to gender inequality, and they're not committed to religious practices having to do with divorce, alimony, and so on. But they dare not speak out against it because they feel they're letting the side down, because the major struggle is with the Hindu majority, which is very oppressive towards Muslims. And that's just a fact. So what I feel when the situation of that kind arises is that there ought to be a way in which we can marginalize, there ought to be an institutional way in which we can marginalize the minority voices within a community. If everybody agrees that most Muslims don't subscribe to these views, and that it's a very shrill but active minority within Muslims who hold these views about the Sharia's, inviolability and so on, we have to find institutions which make it manifest that this is a small minority. But we have no such institutions. The only institutions that can make clear that a particular voice is a fragmentary voice, a small minority in a population, is formal institutions of democracy, representative institutions. And we have representative institutions at the federal level, we have representative institutions at the state level, regional level, we have representative institutions at the municipal level, but we have no idea how to have representative institutions within a community. Communities are dispersed, and we have no way of, if democracy calibrates representation with numbers, and a very small minority of Muslims have this view, most Muslims don't, we ought to find a way of showing that this is an unrepresentative minority, but we can't. We have no institutions to do that. And I think it's one of the great neglects of political sociology that they have not theorized with any depth or detail how we might democratize through representative institutions religious communities. Thank you very much.
Daniel, yes?
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Much appreciation to Helena and James for inviting me. It's awesome to be on this panel. Like with such notions as human rights, humanity, human dignity, and free speech, scholars on the left over the last decade in particular have been keen to point out the ways in which religious freedom has been used as a liberal means for reactionary, anti-liberal, and exclusive political ends. One can simply look at the European Court of Human Rights, which has made several spectacular rulings on the issue, such as Delab versus Switzerland and Lautzi versus Italy, both of which invoked religious freedom in order to deny it to Muslims. In the first case, the court ruled that banning headscarves in Swiss schools guarantees students' rights to be free of indoctrination. And in the second, it simultaneously approved the hanging of crucifixes in all Italian schools. The cross, the court maintained, was not a religious artifact, but a symbol of European culture. And in the United States, religious liberty has been key in the fight waged by evangelical Christians against same-sex marriage. And the striking example of this phenomena, last October, Attorney General Jeff Sessions introduced federal agencies to exempt believers from anti-discrimination regulations, a measure designed to allow Christian bakers, florists, and others to refuse to serve gay weddings. And of course, there was a famous case involving the baker from Colorado. Now, because of all this, it's not surprising that left-leaning historians, anthropologists, and political theorists are arguing that state-directed secularism or religious freedom almost always breeds injustice. The problem, they argue, in part, is that modern and secular states regulate religion in the first place. In deciding which religious customs are acceptable and which are dangerous, states inevitably impose the majority's own religious expectations. And in the liberal West, they do so by relying on questionable understandings of the nature of religion, which, according to this critical literature, is inherently biased in the favor of a rather Protestant conception of religion, whose proper focus locus is the individual, his conscious and personal experience. This is in contradistinction to a Jewish or a Muslim view of things, which focuses on rituals and practices. Now, as such, religious freedom cases are often biased, so the argument goes, against certain religious practitioners who have a different understanding of the meaning of religion in their day-to-day lives. This literature proves entirely convincing in many instances, which is why it has become so influential. And in this regard, I recommend picking up Professor Sullivan's The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. A new edition of it just came out where she explains how her thinking on this issue has evolved over the last 10 years. The question I want to talk about today, which is really discussed by this literature, are the practical and political implications of the claim that religious freedom is impossible, especially in places of great religious diversity, such as here in the United States. With the rest of my time, I just want to say something about the political context from which these critiques emerge, which kind of goes back to the first panel. This literature really blossomed during the time of liberal internationalism that marked the Bush and Obama administrations, and more generally, liberalism's post-1989 global triumph. There can be no doubt that it offers a much-needed critique of this form of governance, especially in light of the liberal rhetoric of Bush's foreign policy that created so much havoc, which in different ways continued on under the Obama administration. The critique also coincided with a period in the United States where Catholics and evangelicals in particular had dropped their theological hostilities to one another, perhaps due to agreements on shared cultural issues, which led Catholics, long hostile to religious freedom as a heretical ideal of the Reformation and Enlightenment, to an embrace of religious freedom. Many Catholics today, though, seem to be turning their back once again on religious freedom. The times are changing. It is my opinion that this critique of religious freedom might not hold up as well in a world that seems to be moving in a different direction away from liberalism and towards, for instance, Christian anti-liberal authoritarianism, like in the Christian democracy of Orban's Hungary, for instance, or if we are to believe academics like Timothy Snyder, the historian Richard Stigman Gall, or the political theorist Jason Stanley, and many others, fascism in the United States. If religious freedom is impossible in liberal regimes, it goes without saying that it will also be impossible in these regimes. And in some ways, these critiques can actually be used by the political right, who equally think religious freedom is impossible, but do so for different political purposes. Clearly, some forms of disciplining and punishing involve more violent forms of exclusion than others. The question then concerns the way forward in a world in which religious freedom is impossible, assuming that not all forms of intolerance are of equal intensity. Perhaps one way forward, if you are stuck in a liberal regime, or believe that such a form of governance is worth fighting for, is to seek reforms based on a desire to increase equality, not just under the law, but also in society, culture, and everyday life. I think this might get at some what Professor Bilgrami was talking about, focusing on the level of the community, the religious community, not just on law. How to do this is the question, and we can talk about that during the question time. Thank you.
Winnifred Sullivan.
So good afternoon. Thank you, Helena, for inviting me so much. So I'm trained in comparative religions, and I'm interested in what happens to religion under the modern rule of law. So stepping back a little bit, perhaps, from the agonistic kind of debate about how liberals ought to govern religion under a religious rights regime. But let me start by saying exactly what Danny has forecast that I'm going to say. So it's commonly said that under a liberal rights regime, the religion that is protected is understood to be primarily about belief. It is something private, individual, chosen, and believed. Our common life is understood to be properly secular. One of the stumbling blocks to universalizing rights to religious freedom is that for most people in the world, religion is experienced as something that is public, communal, received, and enacted. It is about belonging to a community and about what you do together. It is not just or even mostly about believing in God. God may not care whether you believe in her. It is about doing what God wants you to do, whether that is eating certain food or feeding the hungry. The problems arise when what God wants you to do is unpopular or illegal, and liberalism has had difficulty coping with this situation. In fact, I think it has difficulty even talking about God at all, and I'm using God here maybe to stand in more broadly for religion. So I thought it might be helpful, and I think in view of the fact that my colleagues here have not talked about the U.S. so much, that I draw attention to the distinctiveness of the U.S. legal arrangements with respect to religion and religious freedom, because they have produced a particular religious field in the United States, one that is particularly diffuse and difficult to manage. So the First Amendment to the United States Constitution begins with the statement that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I remind you of this because religion in the United States is disestablished, not separated. There is no legal separation of church and state in the United States. That is in part, and this is important as a phenomenological matter, an empirical matter, because there is no church and there is no state in the European sense. This makes it difficult to manage, as I say. We, the people, are sovereign over both religion and government. Other countries have ministries and offices of religious affairs which decide what counts as religion and what is not. You know where to go to argue about it. Religion in the United States is shaped by a much more diffuse thousands of laws, including tax and zoning laws, as well as the laws that govern the administration of schools and prisons and hospitals. But we do not officially know what religion is. We are committed by constitutional conviction to not defining religion, in fact, to ignorance about religion. And we underline that commitment by failing to educate our students about religion, so we have little common language in which to talk about these matters. And U.S. courts have in fact mostly tended to default to a liberal understanding of religion as being about sincere belief. But what that has meant is that we have, that makes religion very difficult to see and to talk about as a common concern. So we are committed to the idea that your religion is what you say it is, and this makes, as I say, the legal protection of religious freedom singularly susceptible to discriminatory administration because of political and cultural prejudice. There is no religious authority in the United States available to ask, for example, whether the Bible in fact prohibits baking a cake for a same-sex marriage, or whether and when animal sacrifice is necessary, or whether wearing a headscarf is cultural or religious. This instability, as I say, is not new in the United States. It's baked in. While it's common today to hear people, well, liberals, say that our religious freedom jurisprudence is broken and that it needs to return to a time when it protected minority religion rather than majority religion, that view is in fact the result of Golden Age thinking. Protecting religious freedom in the United States has always discriminated against minorities, and it has always divided what the majority thought was good religion from what they thought was bad religion. So recent decisions by the US Supreme Court in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and the Hobby Lobby decision, for example, shows the ways in which religion right now, for both the court and for the media, seems to have been reduced today to devout beliefs about sex and reproduction. No actual evidence that these beliefs are religious is needed for this reduction. Opposition to abortion, opposition to same-sex marriage, everyone now knows that these are non-negotiable religious positions, while everyone also knows that favoring them is not. Favoring them is liberal and secular. It's really puzzling, actually, for someone my age who's been studying these matters for decades, how quickly this reduction and this shaping of our public language about religion has happened. Never mind the fact that there are religious-minded and secular-minded people on both sides of these issues. Never mind that most Americans are religiously affiliated. Lining up religion with views about sex is actually a very recent development, and it is both inaccurate as a description of American religious life, and I think it impoverishes our capacity to use religious resources to talk about the common problems that we're here to talk about. So in my view, rather than focusing on the unwinnable argument about what is religious and what is not, whether an employer should be able to refuse to provide contraceptive coverage, for example, or whether school choice should include religiously affiliated schools. We should think about these religious freedom cases in the United States as diagnostic of unsettled social issues. They reveal unfinished business about the American project. And to talk about religion is to, and in religious freedom terms, is to distract us from these questions. So I would say we would not have Hobby Lobby if we had universal health care. So let's talk about universal health care.
Would any of our panelists want to respond to one another? I'm ready to put some questions, if not. So.
I'd like to speak to Akeel, if I might, for a minute, because I had thought of, but obviously didn't have time to talk about this problem of the governance of religious communities, because I think that is a very pressing issue, and it's one that liberal religious freedom regime does not have very good ways of talking about. This is something that you may know that Cécile Laborde has worked on in her, and she and I have talked about. I think, and I'd be really interested to hear how you think we might do this better. My understanding is that Cecile's position still is that religious communities have to really be viewed as voluntary, entirely voluntary democratic. But we know that that's not how people experience community of any kind, but particularly perhaps of religious communities. How do we get out of that bind?
Yes, I think it is one of the really hard questions. And you know, it isn't as if there are no representative institutions which might help with this. You know, so the Parsis, the Zoroastrians in Bombay, have a Parsi Panchayat. It's not very effective, but the fact is, it's a small community. It's all pretty much in one city, and so you could have it. But Muslims, I mean, you know, they're all over, dispersed all over the country. So one doesn't have a real grip on what it would be to organize, say, just an election to find out what, you know, a referendum or
They
have.
do that in Belgium. The government organizes an election among Muslims in Belgium for exactly this reason.
Right, but so tell me more about that. Organizers means what exactly?
Well, my understanding, I'm not an expert on the European situation, and maybe there are people here who are, that there's sort of three different ways in which European governments have tried to create Muslims into representative communities that they can interact with the way they interact with the Vatican, or they interacted with the Jewish notables under Napoleon, and they.
But just as focus question, do they have elections around an issue, or do they have elections that are more chronically institutionalized?
I understand they have elections to create a representative community who can then interact with the government on issues of importance to the community.
I see.
And I think the universities in this context play a role. There are Muslim people at the university that actually act as mediating figures between Muslim society and places of politics. I mean, just to piggyback, I mean, one of the things that seems interesting, just in light of what Professor Sullivan's saying, is there is a secularization that takes place in the 1950s in this country, which marginalized divinity schools in their power, I think, at major centers of major educational centers, to the point to where they were sequestered off and pushed out of, if you will, the role that they once played at major universities like at Harvard or at Yale or at Duke. And I think one of the problems that emerged out of that, especially with the decline of the main line, is you had no mediation between the university and the churches on the ground who could play some kind of mediating role between local communities and institutions of higher education that could provide this kind of, if you will, conversation. And it at the same time, you have scholars arguing around this time, especially in the 70s with Robert Balo, that this coincides with the decline of American civil religion. So one way forward, if you're looking for possible solutions on the ground, is to, and you think theology plays a key role in these discussions, at least insofar as it creates understandings between different communities and secular institutions, is to give divinity schools in this country, especially Protestant divinity schools, a little bit more say. It doesn't have to be just Protestantism. It can be synagogues. It could be Jewish seminaries. It could be the JTS here in New York. It could be any number of institutions. So maybe that's one way to think about a means for providing communications between these communities. It's a very intellectual one. It's a very academic one. But it's something to throw out there.
So, and Bob Jones University and the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think these, even these places that are that exclusionary, that prevent interracial marriage or have ideas that we find to be intolerable, they're having a conversation, trying to understand what's going on, wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. There is no more interracial marriage at Bob Jones, by the way. How did that happen? There have been changes within the Southern Baptist communities regarding women's ordination. This just didn't occur from external pressure. These were debates that were happening within these communities. So if we're concerned that liberals don't understand these people, then even if we find their ideas to be outrageous, I think we should still enter into dialogue with them to some degree.
I think, yes, go up,
So,
please.
so Professor Sullivan, I wanted to actually ask you, say something about your concluding point in your own talk, but on the Belgian, a quick thing, on the Belgian case, I think there are, even in India, a Muslim board, but it's mostly clergy, and it's really not democratically appointed, and I would really want to scrutinize what happens in Belgium as to who is representing and how it gets elected and so on. What I had in mind was we've got a theory of representative institutions in general, which calibrates representation with numbers. That's what you call democracy. And I'm saying we need to extend that to communities, and we don't even have a toehold on how to do that. It's not just that there should be some representatives of a community with whom the government negotiates. That's fine. I mean, but I have in mind something which is really an extension of political sociology that we're utterly familiar with, to a region, to a place where it's very hard to theorize how it might be done. So that's all.
So you're thinking, I understood that, more of sort of self-government as opposed to this kind of
Right.
I mean, I think in the US we're having more recognition of the autonomy of churches, for example,
Right.
and the sovereignty of churches, rather than
Right.
the direction
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
sort of
Yeah.
shoring up of the.
But on your very interesting and provocative concluding point, I wanted to just add that, you know, it's, you mentioned health as a form of significant possible deflection of the issues, health issues. But I just wanted to point out that there's real wisdom in what you're suggesting in general, because if you look at the fact, just on the very kinds of things you're talking about, such as abortion, in your paper, a very large number of women in this country who were against abortion started in the late 70s onwards to move to pro-choice positions. And now, and this is supporting your concluding point about deflection, this was almost entirely a result of reflection on their part that emerged out of a development in political economy of the United States, which was that there was a far larger service sector that emerged. Heavy goods industries were pretty much dying out or reducing substantially. There was a huge service sector that emerged in the 70s, not to mention later on information technology and so on. And all this created opportunities. I mean, the loss of shop floor heavy goods manufacturing led to many more jobs for women than men, and that led them to reflect on these things. And much of their reflection made them change their minds. It's sort of what philosophers like to call a Hegelian internal reflection, through incoming contradictions, which history provides. And so that came as a fortuitous deflection from political economy. And you're absolutely right that we need to find ways in which to induce reflection amongst religious people, but it may not necessarily be through these standard constitutional.
I thought we might come back for a moment to what Daniel referred to as the secularization, which I think many of us as liberals, at least, take to be essential and central to our culture. And when you think about it in that way, I think we have a sense that a great many of us as liberals regard religion exactly as Winnifred described it a little while ago, as essentially a private matter that has really no place in the public sphere. And I think that's something that most of us really have had a great deal of difficulty dealing with, as we've seen more and more pressure in the society to regard religion and religious belief in another way. And I frankly don't know how to deal with that. In some ways, it describes the nature of the divide in societies like this. A division between people who think that there ought to be a place for avowals of religion and for the introduction of religious conviction and belief in the public sphere, and others who believe this is inappropriate and in some ways a violation of our culture. And I wonder if there's any way for liberals, at least, sort of to deal with that divide. When in 2016 we had a great sort of eruption around Hillary Clinton's use of the word deplorables, I think a great many people thought she was talking about people who were attempting to introduce religion into the public sphere, even though that was not, at least ostensibly, what she was referring to. And so anyway, I thought I might put that out there as a question. Is there, in your thinking, a way to sort of reconcile this very fundamental division in the society between the way most liberals regard religious faith and conviction and the way at least devout people do?
I think liberals love their Martin Luther King Jr. religions. They're kind of, they're certain types of religion they have no problem with. It depends on what religion we're talking about. And then within liberal political theory over the last 20 years, you have a huge attempt within political theory and social theory to overcome some of the liberal biases that exclude religious people from the public sphere. We see this in the work of the late John Rawls. We see this in Jürgen Habermas's work, attempts to create more of a democratic sphere for religious voices. So I think liberals, even though they still have a tendency to be in a certain kind of mindset towards religion, there's been a lot of headway made. Professor Sullivan just mentioned Cecile Laborde's new book. I mean, this is a book that takes its inspiration from Rawls and Dworkin and some of the advances they've made about thinking about religion, as thinking it more in terms of a comprehensive doctrine, which kind of gets rid of religion as something special. But I think things have changed a great deal. It's just there's a certain kind of evangelical, Trumpian type religion that's the problem, I think.
Yeah, I think we have to be really, really careful with this word evangelical. Speaking as an American religious historian, I would say that virtually all Protestants in the United States have been since the early 19th century evangelical, small e, evangelical in a broad sense. probably even most religious people in the country, including Catholics, are small e evangelical. That's the style of American religiosity. You know, Nadia and I were talking in the break here. There's almost no mention this morning about media or media shaping of this conversation, but I think particularly with respect to religion, there's an enormous shaping effect by the way in which media represents religion and religious communities, and the constant repetition and identification of something called evangelical Christianity which is now I'm saying large E evangelical Christianity, with a certain conservative politics is extremely dangerous, also inaccurate historically. I think we need to be extremely careful talking about evangelical Christianity.
Let me sort of respond to that a little bit by sort of citing two things which Daniel and Winnifred have said this morning.
Can you speak into the
Oh, sure. One of which has to do with our questionable understanding of the nature of religion, right? And the other having to do with our being committed to ignorance about religion by not educating our students about it. So I wonder whether there is any prospect that liberals would, in the university, for example, but more especially in the elementary and secondary schools, would be interested in introducing religious education into the public curriculum. Is that conceivable?
Well, I mean, it's happening everywhere except the United States.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's massive and impressive efforts to develop school curricula all over the rest of the world that do impressive jobs and sophisticated jobs of introducing students in age-appropriate ways to what religion is, the diversity of religious positions. But we, for both political and, in part, I think, mistaken constitutional interpretations, seem unable to do, and also because of the local administration as opposed to national administration of curricula. We can't do that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I was, after I received my PhD a few years ago, I was invited by, of all places, the University of California, Berkeley, to be the first fellow in public theology at that institution, which was a grant which was supported by the Henry Luce Foundation in an attempt to address the issues that you raise about theological education. Maybe it's happening at places like that. I mean, I think it says something that happened at Berkeley. And so maybe it's happening slowly, but it does seem to be a pity, especially in supposedly the most Christian place in the world. I just want to second Professor Sullivan's point about evangelicals. I was raised a holiness Pentecostal, and we despise the evangelicals because they didn't believe in speaking in tongues, and they didn't believe in all these miracles that we believed in. And we considered ourselves, at least the group that I was part of, as not evangelicals. And then by the Bush years, we were now part of the evangelicals for political purposes. So there are subsets within these groups, and how to parse it all out it's not easy to do. So it's a challenge, no doubt.
Oh, good. Let me ask a question about the degree of tolerance that in an ostensibly liberal society we owe to religious persons who are themselves not only intolerant but often openly aggressive or hostile towards the rights of minorities, certainly. To what degree are we required as liberals to make an issue of those things, and to what degree are we required to hang back and regard that as a choice that people within a certain creed or domain live by? Are we required to speak out about such things? as liberals?
I'm not a moral philosopher, so I don't know how to speak in that register.
Well, you know, I think we have to give this whole question a certain amount of historical and genealogical depth if you're going to get to grips with it. I mean, one thing you might begin to ask is, how did secularism and secular tolerance first get introduced into European societies? Right? What motivated it? And really what motivated it is a very deep and long story which has to do with justifying the state and its power after the divine right of the state as personified in its monarch subsided as a justification as a result of the rise of the new science and so on. And it really began, but state power began to be justified sometime in the 16th and 17th centuries. Really, by the middle of the 17th century, it's the height of this movement towards theoretical movement towards justification was to say that a new form of entity was emerging after the Westphalian peace, and it was completely fused with a new form of centralized institution, which was hitherto scattered. Power was in very scattered locations. It became centered on a state, a nation-state, only sometime in the middle of the 17th century, after Westphalia. So the question arose about how to justify state power, and it was done by creating a feeling for the first half of the hyphenated conjunction, nation-state. And that feeling, so it was no longer theology which justified state power, the divine right of kings, but a feeling for what the state was fused with, this new entity that had emerged, the nation. And that was clearly done for 250 years, and it ended up with Germany in the 1930s and 40s, by saying the nation is ours, not theirs, whether there was an external enemy within. Right? So state power got justified by creating a psychological justification for it, a feeling for a new kind of entity, the nation that had emerged, and it was done by basically religious majoritarianism. The country is ours, not theirs. The nation is ours, not theirs. It's the Jews, the Irish, the Protestants in Catholic countries, the Catholics in Protestant countries. This is European history. European history is the history of the rise of nations which depended on religious majoritarianism. And of course, it had its hideous culmination in Germany in the 1930s. Now, secularism was introduced because minorities, there was a minoritarian backlash to this religious majoritarianism. And when the minoritarian backlash was quite violent all over Europe, it was thought religion itself is the problem, right? Because the religious majorities and the religious minorities, and there's this mayhem of conflict, and therefore religion ought to be ushered out of the polity. And that's how secularism emerged. Now, I think part of the problem now is that since the Second World War, and when Europe started to bring in minorities from its erstwhile colonies to really pick up on a labor shortage after the war, a completely new situation arose because the minorities felt, well, secularism is treating majorities and minorities with minority and majority religions even-handedly. But we have a special problem here as minorities, there's racism against us, and so on, and that's when multiculturalism emerged, right? Because it was felt that secularism was a kind of intolerance towards minorities, not paying special enough attention to them. And I think multiculturalism emerged only because of of that. I think so. The question of tolerance really is tied to these developments since the Second World War, because and that's what I meant by a minoritarian temperament. Now, what is appalling to me, or well, appalling is the wrong word. What is surprising to me is that Muslims, for instance, all over the Middle East, where they're a majority, have a minority attitude. You see, what I mean by a minority attitude is there's a feeling of defensiveness that nobody's tolerant towards us, and so we can get away with our own intolerance towards, women, etc. But there's a so Muslims in India are a minority, and they're really suffering against Hindu majority. But what is amazing is that Muslims all over the Middle East have the same mentality. They think the West, and there's all this history of colonialism, it continues in revised forms. And so what I was calling not the numerical idea of minority, but the defensive attitudes of minoritarianism are very much part of the Muslim attitudes when they're majorities numerically. And what is most grotesque is, I think, that a lot of white Americans think that they also suffer from a minority complex because there's a secular majoritarianism of the coastal elites. So I think it's worth thinking of how there's this similar pattern in the Middle East, in places like India and in the United States, through this notion of a minoritarian complex almost. And it is, I've heard a lot of white Americans say, we are now a minority. We are being treated with the same contempt as minorities are treated. So that attitude is what I'm talking about. I'm not saying the attitude as justification or anything, but they're clearly distortions, and it's genuinely felt. You can't dismiss it as sinister manipulation and so on. Politicians might manipulate it, but I think it's genuinely felt, and it's absolutely grotesque.
I think, if I might just get in on this question about tolerance for a minute, I do think the U.S. has a distinctive history in relation to the history that Akeel has just described in Europe, in part because of, as I said, the lack of any sort of prior story of religious establishment and of union of the church and the state in the divine monarch. And so so there isn't the same kind of anti-clericalism in the U.S. It's a different kind of anti-clericalism. But I also think that it's sheer multiplicity, and it's worth, as some recent historians have done, including Evan Hafley, who's written very interestingly about this, to say that to separate tolerance and toleration, and also Benjamin Kaplan, who've both written about this, that toleration, or peaceable coexistence, if you want, does not necessitate a conversion of people's minds. You don't have to like people to have some kind of common cause with them or some project that you want to do together, whether it's, associating together as in a business way, in a merchants, or some kind of local governance, but that kind of practicality more characterizes the late 18th century, or even the colonial period in the U.S. It was this practicality of just the sheer multiplicity. It wasn't that there was no one who, if they had the numbers, would have wanted to dominate and create an established church in the United States. They simply didn't have it. And so maybe by default, they had to get along. I don't know. So sometimes I think it's helpful to distinguish tolerance from toleration. Tolerance seems to call for, as you were suggesting, a kind of process of conversion or a re-education in which we all have to learn to really like each other's difference, whereas maybe that's not necessary.
Yeah, Daniel.
Up to Professor Bilgrami's comment. I mean, to what extent do you think that mentality, the minoritarian mentality, even though the people are the majority, is to some degree merited? I can give you an anecdote. I was a visiting research professor this summer at a university in Istanbul called Şehir University. It's one of the new universities. I was a visiting research professor at a university in Istanbul this summer called Şehir University. It's one of the new universities that's been established since Erdogan's been in power, and it's pretty pro-AKP. And I got to know a lot of the students there who were pretty outspoken in their support of Erdogan. And I asked a number of, one person in particular, why she was so thrilled with him. And she said, well, I'm 29 years old. Before he came into power, I couldn't go to university because I refused to take off my headscarf.
Before who came to power?
Erdogan. And I couldn't take off my headscarf. Now I'm getting my bachelor's degree, and I just got into a PhD program at Oxford. I don't like the secularists. They had their chance to rule. They didn't do a good job, and now it's our turn. In other words, even, I mean, I sympathize with her, even though I consider myself something of a secularist, but this person was, in some sense, disenfranchised due to an elite group of people who were putting her in her place, telling her that she couldn't have an education. And of course, the majority of the country is Muslim. But there was a group of powerful people who were secularists that prevented someone like her from getting the education that she wanted. So, I mean, in a certain sense, I'm sympathetic to the minority mentality, especially if it's in a group of secularists who aren't allowing someone like that. Now, this is a specific kind of secularism.
Right.
But
you see, the Kemalist Turkey was much more than secularist. It was a state secularization. Right? I think we really have to. I mean, don't think we can get anywhere on the topic of this session without making a distinction, at least a prima facie distinction. You can muddy it later. But if you don't make an initial distinction, I think there's just nothing but confusion that follows. So we need a distinction between secularism and secularization. Right? I mean, secularism is just secularization is a process that Weber talked about, and it's about loss of belief in God. It's got to do with the decline of magic, and, there's a lot of rhetorics around which secularize and disenchantment and so on. Secularism is just something that has to do with steering in the laws of and the institutions of the polities, keeping religion at some distance from it. Right? So a completely devout person, totally non-secularized person can be a secularist. It's just, and there are many, many such. So a city like Tel Aviv, for instance, is completely secularized, but it is not secularist, So there is a real distinction between. The thing with Turkey was that it was not just secularist, it was a state secularization, right? And so there was just the backlash was bound to happen decades later, which is that feeling of minoritarian. But what is interesting in the Turkish case is that the Islamism there is not a jihadi Islamism. There's a jihadi Islamism elsewhere in the Middle East, but the Turkish Islamism is not jihadi. It's not anti-imperialist. In fact, it's bought into neoliberalism, and takes its, dictates from the United States and political economy. That's just the nature of the Turkish economy. And the Islamism, therefore, is completely moderated by that. It's really a reaction to the Kemalist past. It's very different from Islamism elsewhere. You're quite right to say it's part of their national history's minority feeling.
Would anyone like to ask a question? If so, we have microphones on both sides. Yes? Michael, yes?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question that takes off from Professor Bilgrami's point about minoritarian, majoritarian religious groups, and of course this depending on what nation state they're part of, as you're saying, and this relates to the religious history of this country. I think really up until 1930s, 40s, or 50s, and perhaps Professor Sullivan can correct me, I think most evangelical Protestants would have been considered reformers. Some were obviously radicals. Pretty much every major reform movement up until that point, abolition, temperance, Christian socialism, people like Edward Bellamy, and a lot of the progressives too were inspired by what you call evangelical Protestantism, and so. But once, and this begins to happen in the 20s, I think, once the evangelical Protestants become less of a majority, and then finally a minority in the last several decades, that's when their politics begins to be defensive and move to the right. And I wonder whether that, and a subset of that is, I've had an interesting experience when I wrote a book about William Jennings Bryan, that I went to some conservative Christian colleges and gave a talk about it, and they had no problem at all with Bryan's politics, which were very much liberal in the modern sense, social democratic even, you might say, because he was a believer, because he was evangelical. And I would try to say provocative things like, are you in favor of national health insurance? Say, well, if we can define that in a Christian way, yes, relates to what your last point. So I wonder whether, and this is a question, that's my comment, my question is about the future. Is it possible to have a meeting of the minds between secularists and serious religious people? Is it possible to get beyond this minority fear question? And how can liberals, progressives, call them what you will, enable that to happen?
So, I think the most, for me, hopeful place is the undergraduate classroom. Our students are eager to get beyond these divisions, and they're open to crossing. I teach at a public university, Indiana University, in the heartland, and our students are eager to have these conversations and eager to get beyond these divisions, I would say. See, that's the most hopeful. And away from the kind of way in which it's schematized by the media and...
I wonder, I've been thinking for some time now, and I'd be curious to know what you both think about this, whether I'm sort of off beam here or whether there may be something to this thought. I've been thinking that even amongst the people who have taken very very strong views on both abortion and same-sex marriage, which is really the two things that are, it's almost become what Christianity is in the pro-Trump evangelical support for, which in this last election. But I'm just wondering whether even that fragment of the population doesn't think in different frames at different times. Psychologists talk of the frame question, the frame problem, where you think in two different frames and you don't even know you're being inconsistent because they're in different frames, so you can't put it together and see the inconsistency. And I think, if you look at Robert Putnam's accounts of giving, charity and so on, and how it's, people, Christians, evangelicals give much more than Wall Street secularists. And these very people might, be warmongering in Iraq and so on, but they also give donations. They showed remarkable compassion and humanity in many local contexts. So very often, I think what we need to do is to look at the very same people who in one frame are thinking along lines that are remarkably humane, and in other frames are thinking very conventional right-wing, version of religiosity, which is contemporary distortions of religion. And they have no idea that these are inconsistent ways of being and thinking and so on. And part of the importance of politics, I feel, is to remove the boundary between the frames so that they can see that they're inconsistent and maybe scale up the more humane frame. This is what politics should be focused on, and also education. And so there may be this kind of political and moral theorizing, moral psychology here that is very central to how we should begin to think about these things. Sorry, there was another person who
I want to
retired.
I want to raise one question. Yeah, since we have a professor who is specialized in Gandhi, my question is: when you talk about secularism, actually, in Gandhian tradition or in Eastern religion, secularism has different interpretation. It's different from Enlightenment type of secularism. So if we read Dalai Lama, and also if we read Amartya Sen and or Gandhi, so this is what I just want to know. And if we introduce non-Abrahamic religious tradition, maybe the interfaith dialogue already has been going on. So that's, I think, and we can broaden our horizon here.
I didn't understand the question. Could
I'm sorry, if you could rephrase that,
I'm
just
sorry, I'm
a
a
little
little-
more slowly, we're having a little trouble hearing it up here.
Okay. When you talk about secularism, I believe there are two different interpretations. One is more an Enlightenment tradition. Another is Gandhian, or if we read Amartya Sen and his interpretation of secularism. Actually, Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, they follow the same tradition. It means regular secularism does not mean opposition to religion, does not mean non-belief or absence of God. So this is what I think, and if we open up the new horizon from the non-Abrahamic dialogue, and so I think it's something very interesting. Okay.
You can hear it. He's saying that there's an Indian tradition of secularism, a Gandhian tradition that's non-Abrahamic. And what do you think about this, the horizon, the possibility, the viability of this form of secularism?
Well, you know, Gandhi's view was that what I was describing as a European genealogy of secularism, that it came to repudiate the fallout of religious majoritarianism that was the basis of European nation building and the minoritarian backlashes to it. It was a response to that. Gandhi's view was that was never the nationalism in India. We've never gone through that nationalism in India. So secularism is irrelevant to India. Secularism was a response to European nation-building exercises and its fallout. And Gandhi's view was, we never went through that nation-building. So it's not really relevant for us. So Gandhi had a studied indifference towards secularism. Now, of course, he was part of a party, and Nehru and so on went on to articulate secularism, but really secularism was not articulated throughout the very long freedom movement, hardly at all. It was just not relevant. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm going to try and be coherent, even though I'm sort of thinking this question through. One of the mandates of the panel in the description seems to position, and I'm happy to be corrected, sort of the right of religious freedom as a liberal principle versus its attenuation in things like women's rights or gay rights. And part of my question is, I'm not sure that those things work as diagrammatically in opposition to each other. I'm not convinced of it. So let me say the following in terms of context. One of the things that's most recently happened in India is that the Supreme Court has just recently banned triple talaq. Triple talaq is the manner in which some men can say talaq 3 times and therefore divorce their women instantaneously. While many Muslim groups in India were wanting to make triple talaq unlawful as part of their Sharia, as part of their communities, they were very opposed to it becoming criminalized. This is also within the context of a long tradition of both BJP and the Congress government, the BJP being the more right-wing crazy one, Congress less so crazy, but nevertheless wanting a uniform civil code, which feminists in India have for a very long time critiqued as being part of one that would sort of institutionalize the rights, that will sort of institutionalize Hinduism as part of it. So part of this sort of incoherent question, I apologize, is based on this sort of thinking about the fact that women's rights and religious freedom are somehow incommensurate to each other, when this question in terms of triple talaq sort of makes that much more complicated within the domain of politics that's taking place. Thanks.
Anybody want to?
Yeah, you've really just articulated what I was calling the sort of semi-paradox, and And I think that really is a problem. But part of the trouble is that, you know, it is a very, it's a deeply disturbing thing when it turns out that the location from which something is said makes all the difference to the saying of it. It really, I mean, you know, I think politics is at a very debased, is in a very debased state when that happens. So if I as a Muslim were to say, you know, I'm against triple talaq and, you know, I'm in favor of legal rulings about that and so on, that's one thing. But if the vast majority of Hindus who've been, you know, just bearing down the throats of Muslims for 3 decades now, if they say it, it just seems, you know, a completely different thing to say. It's just part of their campaign against Muslims. So it's, you know, I think it's a sign of the debasement of Indian politics that Muslims should be saying this, and Muslims should be, you know, campaigning for these reforms. But if it's just put down by a state that is so manifestly a majoritarian state, it'll come off as just part of the oppression of Muslims. So it's really one of those cases where location matters a lot. And I think that's just a sign that politics is in a very bad state.
I think that's a bit harsh. I think, I'm not sure it's debased. I think it reveals the real complexity of our identities and of our relationships with groups. I mean, I'm not sure that we are going to be able to resolve this through some kind of enlightenment, that our commitments, our feeling of belonging to collectivities is going to always have this ambivalence. It's not just women, although it's often women, but to be a member of a group is always in some sense to suppress one part of you in favor of this other belonging part of you, isn't it? And in a world with 7 billion people, or however many of us there are, the need to have groups that you belong to between you as an individual and the state just seems really necessary.
What I meant was that if I were a Muslim woman, I would feel, damn it, it would be so great if these things were reformed. But I just can't find in this nation a way of getting it done, because if the majority has to be behind it, and if the majority keeps saying it, along with all the terrible things they do to Muslims, it's going to come off as something to be opposed. So from a Muslim woman's point of view, it seems to say, I desperately want this, but the political situation is so debased that I can't seem to be able to find a way for that voice to come, so that it's not just two positions which are in antlers locked. And I think that's a sign that we need something like what you were describing at the end of your talk. We need some deflecting thing which can get us out of that. And I don't know, maybe my rhetoric of debasement isn't exactly right, but it would be some upliftment if we could get that deflection.
Well, I think who was speaking earlier about the ways in which, I'm sorry, I've lost track exactly of the ways in which women evangelicals, yes, you were speaking of this, women evangelicals in this country, no, it was during the break, I guess I was talking to some, women evangelicals in this country were moving towards a pro-choice position partly because of the shift in the labor market into the service industry. And so that kind of practical, material kinds of change is what results in these changes, not, yes.
Right, that's exactly right, yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to take one more question, and then we have to stop. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. As a practical matter in the United States, religion as a political force is become an extremely right-wing phenomenon. In the 50s and 60s, there were lots of Jewish groups bringing constitutional cases that created separation of states and separation of church and state. And of course, the civil rights movement was a religious movement in many respects. But today, if you look at the Jews, actually, all the energy is coming from Orthodox people who have a very cynical view of how to manipulate the political system on behalf of their own interests. And then if you look at the Trump administration support from evangelicals, given Trump himself, and the agenda that they are pushing, one has to conclude that they're the enemy of liberalism. And in the previous panel, we talked about how what we need is a stronger left-wing movement to push liberalism into the public realm with more guts. And we're faced with the following conundrum. On the one hand, we're supposed to embrace difference and accept their cultural beliefs and respect them, etc. On the other hand, they're seeking to destroy the very values to which we adhere. So I'm wondering if we liberals are coming to this gunfight with an article that's been peer reviewed.
Daniel, do you want to come in? You look like
Can somebody please repeat that? I don't want to miss out on the hilarity. What was the last remark? Oh, in fact, I'd really...
You come to a gunfight with an article that's peer reviewed. Bang.
Were we all supposed to say something? I find that this is just, I have so many anecdotes today, but I find that people on the left whose parents voted for Trump are not as harsh or more understanding of why that decision was made. I know a lot of liberals and leftists who despise Trump, but don't go so far as maybe a Timothy Snyder is going and saying that we're entering into a new age of fascism. In other words, and maybe this just gets at some of the things that we're talking about, when you understand the people that you're critical of a bit more, it creates a context, I think, for communication and a deeper, for ways of perhaps changing things. And maybe practically what that would involve or demand would be for us liberals, or however you want to describe us here, to get to know these people a little bit more instead of sending your kid to China for the senior going to spend a year abroad. Maybe send them down to Alabama. It's just remarkable to me that so many people up here. I grew up in the South. I have friends who won't drive there. Wouldn't it be a bad idea to get to know some of these people a little bit better and figure out, not saying they're going to change their mind or you'll change your mind, but it seems as though part of the issue is, at least from going through these issues with my own family and communities, there's just no dialogue whatsoever, and it seems like you got to get that started somehow.